Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's ACOM seminar. It is my greatest pleasure that I have the chance today to introduce our speaker, Frank Flocke, who I believe is known to many, if not most of you, and really shouldn't need much introduction. Frank is a scientist in ACOM. Frank got his PhD at the University in Wuppertal in Germany. And then the first time he came to NCAR, that was in '92, actually. First, he only came here as a postdoc for 1 year, but then after a short return to Germany, came back to NCAR in '94 and has been here since. Frank is an extremely highly respected expert in atmospheric chemistry research, and he's really a true leader in instrumentation to measure atmospheric composition. His focus is on the measurement of gas phase compounds on the ground, but specifically on aircraft. But his expertise and his activity are far not limited to the measurement techniques per se. Rather, it extends to air quality analysis. It extends to field campaigns, where he is really engaged from the design to the execution to the analysis. He's very strongly active in using process models to interpret field and laboratory data. And he also closely interacts with 3D modelers, such as myself in his research. Frank has served as a mission scientist on well over 20 aircraft campaigns. And I myself had the pleasure and the honor to co-lead with him the FRAPPÉ campaign, which took place in 2014 right here in the Front Range. And I believe FRAPPÉ is one of the topics he will be talking about today. And without any further ado, I will hand over to Frank, and I look forward to hearing from him on his research on the chemistry of pollution plumes. Frank, the podium is all yours.
Thanks, Gabi, for the very generous introduction. I assume that you can see my screen now. I will tell you today, I will use two recent field campaigns to tell you how and why we use aircraft to go about addressing air quality problems. And I will then close the talk with bringing up some ideas on how we might do an even better job at this. To start out, I'd like to introduce a few basic concepts. I'll be talking a lot about air quality, ozone, organic nitrates, and photochemistry. So let's try and get this out of the way first. So why do we care about air quality? Air quality is often called the silent killer. It's a little bit dramatic, but it indeed causes more premature deaths in the world than any natural disaster. It just does it in a very quiet way and slow way. So it doesn't catch headlines like natural disasters usually do. And if you look at this graphic here, you can see that some places in the world are doing worse than others, and that while the US is looking relatively good, we still have quite a few air quality problems in our nation to deal with as well. About half of the population in the US lives in areas that currently violate one or more of the national ambient air quality standards, and this is explained over here. This comes from the Clean Air Act that was enacted in the 1970s originally, and it's been refined ever since. It mainly regulates 6 criteria pollutants that are essentially, they're called criteria pollutants because they sort the different areas into the bad boys and the really bad boys. There are various grades of non-compliance that the metro area can be in. And I will be talking about ozone more today. And the standard for ozone, the 8-hour average, if the 8-hour average exceeds 70 ppb on several occasions, there's a formula to do this, then you are in non-compliance with the standard, and just keep the 70 ppb in mind for later on. The next slide will be showing you a little bit of chemistry, and it's necessary to explain some of the concepts that we'll be using throughout this talk. Looks scary at first, but it isn't really that difficult. So VOC and NO. Those are primary emissions for the time being. This is the easiest way of assuming this. And the way VOCs are oxidized in the atmosphere is that they initiated during the day. The initial reaction is the reaction with the OH radical, which essentially takes one hydrogen off the VOC, and this ends up making an RO2 radical here. The OH is formed from ozone and water in the atmosphere together with sunlight. This is sunlight is the driver for our chemistry during the daytime. So these RO2 radicals, they then react with NO and make NO2. And in this process, you oxidize the VOC a little bit more and you make an OVOC, which then can go back into the front. And this goes on and on until you create a final product, which is either a sort of aerosol where the hydrocarbon becomes soluble, goes into cloud water or into an aerosol, or it goes all the way to CO2, which is the end product of all hydrocarbon oxidation. Some of those OVOCs, they can photolyze directly with sunlight and make more RO2s, but many of them go back and they react with OH and make RO2s. So this down here is the ozone machine. So every time an NO gets oxidized to NO2, this NO2 photolyzes, releases one oxygen atom, and makes an ozone. So this is the ozone machine that goes around, and it's fed continuously by these RO2s that come in here, while the VOCs are the fuel. They are being burned in the process. The NO and NO2 just go around in circles and make ozone. There are, however, two reactions that take the NO2 out of the cycle, and those are the reactions with RO2 themselves. They can cause the formation of what we call organic nitrates, or they react with OH and make nitric acid. When this happens, you don't make ozone, and you slowly reduce the amount of NOx that is available to drive the ozone machine. So the boiled down version to remember for the next 40 minutes is that VOC plus NOx, they either make ozone or they make organic nitrates. And there's one special treat about the organic nitrates, and that is they can, as they live in the atmosphere, they can be photolyzed, or they can react with OH themselves. And some of them, they release NOx back into the atmosphere. And this is important because in this process, very often, the NOx is consumed faster than the VOCs. And so the later release or not from those RNO2s, as the atmosphere becomes more pristine, can extend the ozone formation cycle by bringing those back into the cycle. And that's important whether that happens or not. So it's very important to understand the chemistry of these organic nitrates. So why we go through the trouble in putting instruments on aircraft? And the reason for that is that transport and chemical processes in the atmosphere really happened in 3D space. So this is actually not a bad representation of the Front Range, except there's way too little traffic on this road here. We have factories, we have urban areas, we have agriculture, we have potentially wildfires in the plains, and then we have air that gets transported around into the mountains, which produces ozone, it produces haze, it can have biological effects on natural resources, and all this happens in 3D space. So in order to represent this and follow the chemistry along and really know what is going on in the boundary layer and how it mixes with air that is above the boundary layer of different composition, an aircraft is really the way to do this. And this brings me to FRAPPÉ. FRAPPÉ was a campaign that took place in 2014, and the goal of that campaign was to describe the air quality in the metro, in the Northern Colorado Front Range metro area, NFRMA, and find out which emission sectors are contributing most to our ozone problem here. So the non-compliance status of the Denver area with the ozone national ambient air quality standard was the primary motivation for this. And as we all know, we have seen a large population increase and a boom in oil and gas and natural gas extraction in the area. And in fact, since FRAPPÉ, the NFRMA has been downgraded twice to worse pollution violations, from marginal to moderate and now to severe, and they're on the cusp of being upgraded to extreme. FRAPPÉ also raised awareness of NCAR in the public and the stakeholder community. That was another motivation for us to do this. And the third motivation was that we were able to attract NASA's Discover AQ team. That was a campaign that had been going on since 2011, and they were not sure where to conduct their fourth campaign. And we were able to attract them to the NFRMA to work with us on this problem as a result of FRAPPÉ happening. So early on, I teamed up with Gabi, and it's always good to have an experimentalist and a modeler lead an experiment. And the two of us went on quite a crusade to find funding for this to happen. We gave countless talks to the public and to stakeholders, and finally were able to secure funding from the state of Colorado and from NSF to make this mission happen. And as it always happens, if you start it, they will come. We ended up mobilizing a large fraction of the air quality community, both the academic and regulatory community, particularly with many local groups participating on the ground and on aircraft. My role as one of the PIs of the project was to, of course, define the science questions and the payload requirements for the aircraft. I designed the flight plans. I directed all flights as mission scientist on board. And that includes kind of being the liaison between the RAF pilots and the RAF project managers to, work out the best plan of getting the science done and getting, all science groups engaged into this project. I also had my parent instrument on board, which measures some of these organic nitrates I've been talking about. And of course, you can't do this all by yourself. I had help from many colleagues. Gabi was the co-PI, as she already mentioned. She led the forecasting and chemical transport modeling team, which is equally important to actually flying and making measurements. She successfully kept me out of trouble during the campaign. I'd like to thank Daniel Bond for coordinating ground activities, Steve Schurtz and Lisa, who took care of my PAN instrument when I was too busy directing flights, and then of course the UL RAF team and pilots who kept the C-130 going where it needed to go and kept us all safe. Interpreting the FRAPPÉ results required using a chemical transport model. And in order to do this correctly, to simulate the NFRMA air quality, we need to make sure that we have our emissions in order. We need to make sure that we adequately model the meteorology in the model and the transport that results from that. And of course, we need to get our chemistry right. So in the next 10 minutes, I will go through stepwise through all of these things and how we made this work. The Northern Front Range metro area has a very diverse mix of emissions and also quite complex meteorology. And this map here shows the non-compliance area here in yellow. You'll see this quite a bit when I show these maps. Here's the Denver metro area. Here's Boulder, Fort Collins, Greeley. And you see those pink dots here. All those pink dots are active oil and gas wells as of 2014. There were about 30,000 of them. And they are located to the north and northeast of the metro area. So we have these oil and gas emissions. We have all the traffic and urban emissions that are, essentially prevalent throughout the I-25 corridor and mostly west of there. And then just north and east of the Denver metro area, we also have a large industrial area, a power plant, including a refinery and quite a bit of other industry that is just in between the oil and gas area and the urban area. The meteorology of the Front Range is also quite unique, as during the summer when we have high ozone events, and particularly then when the region is under a high pressure system and there's not a lot of external meteorological forcing, the local flows are driven by thermal heating of the terrain. Because of the mountains to our west and how they're oriented, right after sunrise, the slopes tend to heat up, and it causes an upslope flow to set up that essentially pulls emissions from the plains into the mountains while they're being processed. Then at night, this reverses and it goes backwards. And so this is this upslope, downslope flow that we experience here during the summer, which is an interesting phenomenon. And of course, it needed to be taken into account planning this campaign. As I said before, we were successful in attracting the NASA team to help us with this experiment. And these two maps, and make sure you note the different scales here. This is the same red outline area that is shown here. These are the flight tracks of the NASA P3 and the B200. Those were two aircraft that were continuously characterizing the air quality in the front range when they were flying, because their goal was to establish a relationship between satellite observations and ground-based air quality. So they were interested in just continuously sampling the air in the front range area and relating that to satellite measurements. But this was good for us because we, the C-130 then, could had a more flexible flight plan that we could follow. And we could look at emissions, we could follow the chemistry into the mountains. You can kind of see these flights around here. And we could also look at the bigger picture. We were looking at inflow, what might be coming in from the western slope, and also outflow, i.e. what is the impact of the Denver area on outlying areas that are downwind of the area. So those emission flights that I was talking about earlier, when we were looking at trying to characterize and see whether the emissions that were going into the model were correct, were kind of lawnmower patterns that we would fly repeatedly over the entire area during stable meteorological conditions, and then relate the measurements that we did with the aircraft to what we expected from what the model would tell us should be there, where the aircraft was at any given time. And this here, you can see this flight track is colored by ethane, with the cold colors being low concentrations, hot colors being high concentrations. I will use the same color scale from now on for all of these plots. And you can see that the ethane, which is an oil and gas tracer, it comes from oil and gas, in this case, is mixed into the northern, this is the Denver area here. This particular meteorology was mixing this ethane into the northern part of the urban area coming out from the oil and gas area. And if you show this in this particular day on the 28th of July, you can see that most of the ozone is formed where the two areas border onto one another, where the emissions from the oil and gas area and the urban emissions are mixing together. This was where the highest ozone was observed on this day. To follow the upslope and follow the chemistry, we took a different approach. The idea was to fly what we call stacked walls on the aircraft, where we fly north-south transits at different altitudes in and outside of the boundary layer, and characterize the transport and also the mixing that is going on while the air is being pulled into the mountains by the upslope conditions. If you look at a flight path like this, a typical flight path that's looked at from above, and obviously there's some of those tracks are on top of one another here. But again, this is colored by ethane. And you can see that here's a little bit of an upslope day with a slightly southerly component here. And you can see that the emissions from the oil and gas area are transported towards the west and a little bit to the north here, where the ethane values are elevated in this area here. And here's where there's no more emissions, but they're just transported along. If you color the same flight path by NOx, which is more of an urban transport tracer, you can see the outflow from the Denver area. But you can also see some elevated NOx here in the Greeley area, which is partially from oil and gas, partially from traffic. And then if you color the same flight path by ozone, you can see that both the oil and gas emission area and the emissions from the urban area very efficiently produce ozone as the air mass drifts into the mountains here. And in this particular day, we even observed spillover into the adjacent valleys. This was a late day missed approach we did on the airport in Granby, and you can see how high the ozone was. And actually the model was predicting this very nicely on this day. So this is looking at the whole situation from the side. This is at 40 degrees north, the elevation profile here. Here's the Continental Divide, here's Granby, Denver, and Greeley. And you can see this ozone being formed as it's being pulled into the mountains, then spills over into the Granby area. Some of it gets pushed by the synoptic flow, pushed out. as this. And you see that the model was predicting, on this particular day, was predicting this very nicely. And so this again is another model run that we can use for looking at the chemistry and the emissions at the same time. So going back to the emissions, they turned out to be generally underestimated. Here, those yellow bars were the best estimate a priori emissions that we were putting into the model for forecasting and initial modeling purposes. And as for comparison, here are the EPA 2011, 2014, and 2017 inventories. This is for NOx here on the left and VOCs on the right. And you can see there's a general trend of NOx going down. I get back to this later. The best estimate, those were numbers that were based on the 2014 inventory and also data from Colorado, the state of Colorado, that were compiled together and turned into this best estimate. It turned out that the NOx emissions were actually low. We needed to increase all NOx emissions outside of the Denver urban area by a factor of 2 in order to get our, to best match what was observed during the aircraft flights. Similarly, for VOC, the situation was even a little bit more extreme. In fact, we had to double all oil and natural gas emissions except ethane, which tells you something about what is known and was not known. Ethane mostly comes from pipeline leaks, and so it seems like these are quite well known, but all the other emissions from fracking activities, condensate tanks and such were grossly underestimated. They had to be up by a factor of 2 in order to get them correct. So now that we have transport and emissions right, and we know the days where the model does a good job, we can start playing games with this in order to figure out where our ozone comes from. And this is for the 28th of July here, an example where this is the ozone that was predicted by the model and verified by the aircraft flights. And you can see here that over the mountains, we have a background of somewhere around 45. And in the metro area, ozone easily exceeds the standard. This goes over 80 parts per billion here. And this is Broomfield. Here's Denver, again, DIA, just for your orientation. Boulder is about here. On this particular day, in the southern part of the Front Range, we had ozone exceedances. And now we can go in the model and turn off all the anthropogenic emissions and see what the difference is. And what you can see is that the difference, if all anthropogenic emissions are turned off, is about somewhere between 30 and 40 parts per billion. So if you subtract 30 to 40 parts per billion from this, you end up with the background. So that means that all our local ozone and the exceedances that we see as a result are all actually caused by local emissions. But you can now go a step further and just turn off individual emission sectors and see what their contribution is. And here is also for the 28th of July is one example. Again, here is the ozone reduction that you would experience if you turned off the oil and gas contribution. You can see the scale here goes to 10. The mobile contribution, the contribution from industry, and the contribution from CEMs. This is continual emission monitoring. This is mostly power plants and some other larger emitters that have continuous monitors in them that are required by the EPA to do this. And you can see that the major contributors here are the mobile contributions, transport and urban traffic, and the oil and gas. And we did this for several days and across the campaign, and it's kind of like an emerging picture that the mobile and oil and gas contributions are about 40% each to the total ozone that is formed in the area. I said we also had to get the chemistry right. We did this too. We looked at our chemistry by using, comparing explicit chemistry models with the often simplified chemistry that we have to use in transport models, because transport models cannot quite handle the complicated chemistry. They wouldn't run anymore within a reasonable time on any supercomputer. So what we do is we use aircraft samples that are characteristic for a particular emission area, stick them in a jar and do chemistry with them. Then we use the a box model to simulate the chemistry here, using a simplified mechanism from a CTM and a explicit chemistry mechanism, and compare the two, make sure they come out the same. And then we can also do the same trick that we did with our 3D model, where we then take the emissions from whichever sector we are looking at out. So we modify this sample, take the emissions out and run it again and see what the difference is in the amount of ozone we make. So I give you one example here. This is a sample that was taken over Weld County from the C-130. And here the blue line is the simplified chemistry that is used in the transport model. The red line is explicit chemistry. We use the University of Leeds master chemical mechanism here. And you see that they're pretty close, which is good. So that means our chemistry is good. Then when we modify this sample and take the oil and gas emissions out of this sample and run it again, we see an ozone reduction of about 35%, which pretty much jives with what we saw in the transport model before. So our chemistry is okay too. So this is how we essentially produced the results that were used for advising the state on their ozone and air quality problems. So in summary, FRAPPÉ provided a useful and actionable data to the CDPHE and the public. We brought together a very large team to address a timely problem. We successfully raised public awareness through numerous outreach events. And here's one example. This is the open house that EOL put on for the FRAPPÉ mission. That was a huge success. Over 1,000 people come to this. We also gave numerous outreach talks. Afterwards, we are giving one in about 2 weeks at the library in Longmont, in fact, and also to stakeholders. We published a campaign overview paper summarizing all FRAPPÉ results. We produced an extensive report to CDPHE that defined the steps necessary to address the air quality in the NFRMA and the impact on the adjacent mountains, including Rocky Mountain National Park. I believe that we successfully elevated the image of NCAR, ACOM capabilities and EOL capabilities as well, and our expertise in public to the public and to the regulatory stakeholder community. So other than population growth and resource extraction activities, the other emerging air quality issue in the Western United States and also elsewhere in the world are wildfires. And this brings me to the second campaign analysis I want to bring up here. This is a photo that I took from the C-130 over Western Montana, just east of the Bitterroots, where there were 3 fires burning simultaneously in that wilderness area in August of 2018. The Western Wildfire campaign, the Western Wildfire Experiments for Chemistry, Aerosol Absorption and Nitrogen, or WECAN 2018, happened on the C-130. This was a priority for NSF and also for other agencies that were originally, we were going to do this together with NASA and NOAA, but because of a scheduling problem, we had to go it alone in 2018. This is Emily Fisher from CSU, who was the PI on this project, on this NSF project. And she and her co-PIs were very inexperienced in conducting aircraft missions. And I had an instrument on the airplane, but I was also asked to mentor the young scientists that were leading this mission in conducting an aircraft experiment. So my role was to mentor Emily Fisher, Lou Hu, and Delphine Farmer on the mission scientist role. I helped them with in-flight planning, introduced them to pilot and communications and listening to air traffic control and interpreting what they're saying, which really is helpful for making in-flight decisions. And I also helped them make calculations that were needed. And this ended up really requiring 2 people in the cockpit at all times. I also assisted with campaign goal tracking, daily target selection, and I also had my pan measurement on board again. And here I have to thank Jacob Lindas for help with the instrument when I wasn't able to do it. So wildfire plumes are really the classic situation for sampling from aircraft. So the way this looks like is this was our target fire here, the bear trap fire. And so we would approach this with the aircraft, fly around, get a view, and then we would follow the plume downwind, calculating these distances by the observed wind speed from the aircraft and trying to follow the plume as it was drifting away from the fire. And later I will show you some results from these yellow tracks that we're going across here. But this is really typical. You can only do this with an aircraft. So what happens in a smoke plume as it drifts away from its source? So first you have the fire here, and then you have some time that goes by before you can probe this plume with the aircraft for the first time. And this is, you really don't know what happens here. except you have some laboratory data that tells you what should have been coming out of the fire, and you have your first observations here. The other thing that happens as you go downwind, and then after the first observation, you can follow the chemistry with the aircraft and the plume, but there are things happening. For example, the plume is diluting. As a result of that, the plume gets lighter, so there's less absorption of sunlight in this plume, so the chemistry changes as the plume goes along. Other things that happen is this is a very difficult environment for flying because you can't see anything. You have to fly under instrument flight rules, and the chemistry that is happening is extremely complex, as I will show in a little bit. There are also sampling challenges. The gradients between outside the plume and inside the plume are extreme, about as extreme as it gets, which causes instrument contamination. It can cause interferences in instruments. It can cause also contamination of the inlets of the instruments that will give you problems as you go along. It can also, in extreme cases, cause signal saturation. That instruments just don't have the dynamic range to go from a concentrated plume to the outside. So I will get back to this as we go along. The idea that we have here, why are we looking at this fire plume composition in chemistry, is quite simple. At the end of the day, we want to end up with an Earth system model that accurately predicts air quality and climate impacts from wildfires. What we normally have in the way of data is continuously available data. We only have satellite measurements of the fires themselves. They know something about the fire size. They know how hot they burn. We have fire radiative power. And we have some basic tracers, maybe CO, maybe some others. And if we are lucky, we may have some ground-based monitors that might be running and are affected. But most of the time we don't. And we have fire lab emission data that we can scale to some of those basic tracers and then feed that into the model. We really know nothing about how the 3D distribution is, where the plumes go, and how they dilute out. This is all something that we need to assume. Now, when we make those measurements, we can make those models a little bit more intelligent about this. So we can put our measurements into a fire plume model that explicitly models the fire plume. If we do this often enough, we can gather some statistics about how this relates to some of those continuously available data that we have. And we also have some chamber studies where we look at the chemistry in a controlled environment and make smarter our fire plume modeling. And I'll get to that in a little bit. And then if we do this often enough and we have some statistics, then we can make our system model smarter. This is really where we're going here. So one of the things we need to deal with is if we make these measurements in the plume of various ingredients, like for example the VOCs here, we want to boil this down to some of the most important ones, because we can't handle the chemistry of hundreds of species. So here is one example where a major fraction of the reactivity, which is a cumulative reactivity here in the plume, is plotted on this plot. And you can see that a small number of hydrocarbons here are accounting for most of the reactivity. But this is the reactivity that was measured by this particular instrument. I got a file yesterday from Eric Apel from our group in ACOM, ACOM's TOGA group, who did the same thing for their measurements for another fire that was observed. And you can see that this is very different. They agree on acetaldehyde and formaldehyde, but the other compounds that are here, and some of them have very, very complicated chemistry, is very different. So the question is, what is the fraction of the real total reactivity? Can we combine these? How can we get to this? And the other thing is that those green compounds here, they are not only primarily emitted from the model, but they are also formed in the chemistry of the model. So this is quite a complicated problem that needs to be addressed. I will point out some of those complications with two examples, compare two fires here. This is a plot that shows the relative production efficiency of ozone in two different fire plumes, for the Bear Trap fire down here and the Taylor Creek fire up here. And we often use CO as a nominator because CO is essentially an inert tracer on the time frame that a fire plume holds together. It's a slow reacting compound that is essentially chemically inert for this time frame. And so we can use this to account for dilution. We can use this to account for just the general thickness of a fire plume and relate other chemical products to this to compare them directly. And you can see here that the Taylor Creek fire produced about almost 10 times as much ozone per time than the Bear Trap fire, even though they had very similar VOC emissions. And what was very different between those two fires was that the initial NOx and the initial nitrous acid, I'll get to that in a second, were about 20 times higher in the Taylor Creek fire than they were in the Bear Trap fire. So we decided to use the Gecko A model, which was developed in ACOM together with Lisa in France. And this Gecko A this is the generator of explicit chemistry and kinetics of organics in the atmosphere. And it is a piece of software that generates chemical mechanisms based on a list of initial species that is provided to the software. It applies all the known chemistry that we know about from laboratory and theory. It calculates all the reactions and rate coefficients based on the class of molecule that is an initial species, looks at all the products, and then the products are cycled through the generator again. This product repeats until some sort of end product is made, either water, CO2, or an aerosol. And this causes quite explicit chemical mechanisms. For example, a fire plume model with about 40 initial species results in a mechanism with over 1 million reactions in 50,000 species. This is something that you have to run on Cheyenne, for example, to do this in a reasonable time. There's a small group of us that are still teaching it new tricks. Fire plume modeling is kind of part of that overall effort to make this model better and more smart. So I'll start out with modeling the Bear Trap fire, which is shown here. And you can see we are doing a fairly good job modeling our ozone that was produced in the plume. And this is, again, this is all relative to CO. We do a good job with our NOx, and we do a good job with our nitrous acid, and we also with some of the nitrates. And this is even modeling the first 20 minutes before our first observation using scaled laboratory data. We were quite successful modeling this. This was not true for the Taylor Creek fire. So the way we modeled the Taylor Creek fire, and this is just, this starts with the first observation here. These are 5 plume passes that were done within about an hour. And what we did is we tailored the model to reproduce the observed decay of the nitrous acid. And what nitrous acid does, it photolyzes in the atmosphere very rapidly, and it makes OH and then O. And I showed you at the beginning of this talk how important both of those are for chemistry. They're really chemistry accelerators. So this is how we set the model up. But if we do this, we are not able to reproduce the observed decay of the NO2. In fact, there's an NO2 increase just as a result of the NO that's coming out of this photolysis here. We just can't remove it fast enough. While we are somewhat able to reproduce the ozone that's being made in this particular fire plume, we grossly overestimate our organic nitrates. Here's PAN as an example in the model. And we also were not successful by trying to reduce some of this HONO, because this really accelerates the chemistry. If we do this, we get some of the things right, but we don't get our ozone right anymore. We only make about half as much ozone as it takes. So there's general inconsistencies in this. The other thing is that the observed decays in some of those VOCs that are emitted by the fire are also not reproduced in the model. Our model makes those go away much faster than they actually go away in person. However, we are having many inconsistencies in between different instruments here. And this is just one instrument shown. So we are not yet able to reconcile all of these inconsistencies in this, but there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we are looking at the chemistry here. So what this tells us is that fire plume chemistry is enormously complicated. It tells us that it reveals some of the shortcomings in both our understanding of the chemistry and also maybe on our measurement capabilities, because there are still issues out there. So this is ongoing work, and we are collaborating with a number of groups in the community that were involved in this experiment to try and figure this out. The remaining issues are, are there interferences in the VOC measurements? Are there other ways to reconcile the VOC data? Are the HONO values really as high as they are? Most importantly, are we missing nitrate chemistry? The reason for that is we really don't have much of a constraint here because we don't have very good measurements of complex organic nitrates and almost no gas phase data for WECAN. Which brings me to the future outlook, which will certainly have some sharp curves in it, as it always does. So despite continued progress in many regions, I think air quality will continue to be a concern for most of the US and the world's population, more so in developing countries. Wildfires are a growing concern for air quality, especially locally and in the Western United States. In the US and Europe, and I showed this when I showed the emission inventories, anthropogenic NOx emissions and ambient NOx also are trending downward, which changes the chemical regime that governs ozone and production of aerosols. And I alluded to that with the little cartoon that showed the recycling of NOx from the nitrates. And this is another thing that gets much more important when NOx is low to start with. Recent field campaigns and chamber work also suggest that we have gaps in the measurements, that we need to consider improvements in the instrumentation and also improvements of the sampling, and possibly also changing our approach to field campaigns. So one way we are addressing this is, especially for measurement gaps, is the APROC project, of which I am currently the PI. We've long known that inlet lines in aircraft can be a major detriment to sampling and accurate measurements of some of the compounds that we are interested in, particularly on some aircraft that have less access to direct holes in the wall where you can put probes. And knowing this, in 2017, we started developing a wall-less inlet system that is really only possible out on the wing part. You can't do this in the aircraft if you have an instrument in the cabin, just because of the fact that you always have to have an inlet line. And this was a project we did in 2017. Here's Steve Schurtz shown, and Kaylee Barnes. She was a student intern that worked with us, and Steve continues to do most of the engineering work on this project. So what we did is we showed that by using a nested inlet design, we can successfully reduce the airspeed to a reasonable point so that we can deal with this with an instrument inlet being right here. By dumping in succession the majority of the flow overboard and just sampling successively from the core of the flow so that the core of the flow has not seen any wall contact yet. So by doing this in a smart way, you can make sure that your instrument is sampling the same air that was outside without any influence on wall contacts. This is what that would look like when it is in the pod. So what we are planning doing in APROC is using this inlet that we have developed, implementing it into the pod, and then putting a chemical ionization mass spectrometer for the measurement of VOCs and other surface-sensitive gases onto the aircraft with having at least the sampling problem out of the way. APROC is a collaborative project. We are collaborating with EOL, with the University of Washington for instrumentation and others. It will provide new measurement capability to the community. It will use this wall-less inlet. We will make better measurements as a result of these red species that we really need to know well, as I said before. And we also will preserve some cabin space for additional payload. Complementary with this, our in situ measurement group is currently, we just sent a proposal, an MRI proposal in, and Alessandro Franchine from our group is the PI on this, to modernize ACOM's photochemical tracer suite and then integrate it into the second wing pod, which would even free up more room on the in the aircraft cabin as a result, and balance the airplane out. I think we also have to take a fresh look at how we do field campaigns. I think investigating the complex chemistry of VOC oxidation along the gradients of NOx requires a more process-based, focused field campaign. We try to do or propose do-it-all field campaigns now, and I think they're too complicated for their own good. So I'm planning on proposing the Copacabana Project, which is a targeted approach to understand carbon oxidation processes as a function of NOx availability and the sequestration and the role of NOx and its effective lifetime. So one example for this is a power plant in the forest. This is an isolated large NOx source in a relatively pristine environment with an even distribution of VOC sources. So what this would look like is, and this is another power plant here. This is the Cumberland plant in Tennessee. In fact, I flew this in 1999 with NOAA, but we weren't able to nearly do the kind of measurements that we are doing now. So what you have here is you have a fairly pristine background air that is not very much influenced by anthropogenic emissions. You have a strong NOx plume that goes away from this power plant here. You can look at this like as a smoke plume, but only with NOx in it. And you have continuous emissions of VOC, biogenic VOC in this case, from the forest. So what you would do is you would fly through this and you would experience a strong gradient in the NOx concentrations here from almost zero or like very low 50 parts per trillion, typical background in this area, to tens of ppb back down. And you could very reliably look at the chemistry as we go along as a function of this availability here. If you wanted to look at aromatics or alkanes doing the same thing, you could do this, for example, downwind of the Sinclair, Wyoming refinery. This is a very large source of aromatics and alkanes from this petrochemical processing station in a completely pristine environment without any anthropogenic or biogenic emissions. And it has a power plant here, right in the middle of it, which will produce your NOx, and you could do the same thing downwind of this and look at this chemistry here. Similarly, you could do this downwind of a processing facility in Weld County. And if the wind is right, this would drift over a large emission source for oil and gas, and you could do a similar experiment here. So you break it down into the basics, you break it down into the elementary chemistry that you can reliably observe again and again and again as a function of NOx, and then use an explicit chemistry model to tease out the processes that are then important to put into chemical transport models that will describe air quality. APROC and Copacabana, they both fit squarely into the mission of ACOM, which is to advance measurement capabilities for the community, study atmospheric chemistry processes, design and support community field programs, engaging the community in those, and distill and incorporate new processes into Earth system models, which will make them smarter with respect to air quality. Many of those are collaborative across NCAR labs with EOL, CGD, and others that we are collaborating with. Finally, let me acknowledge my colleagues that without which this would not have been possible. There's a large number of people in ACOM that helped in this in various ways. Some of them very important, like Steve for engineering, and without Garth, nothing would work in ACOM because all our computers would be dead by now. We have the group of the FRAPPÉ and NASA Discover AQ group here, some of those who were really involved in this. The PIs for the WECAN team, Suresh Daniala, who did some of the flow modeling for us for the Inlet project, and then of course the EOL and RAF crew that makes all those flights possible and gets us where we need to go to get our chemistry. Thank you for your attention. Be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Frank. A very, very nice talk. So, and I guess you have already some questions here. So let's just go from the top down. From Kirk, hi Frank. One of your FRAPPÉ slides showed that they were modeled oil and gas ozone oil and gas produced ozone was, I think, 12 ppb, making 35% of the total front range produced ozone. So this would imply 34 ppb of total ozone produced locally. So in this case, does that mean the background was approaching the EPA limit of 70 ppb? And if so, was that frequent?
Yeah, so it would have taken a little bit too much time to explain this. So this was a sample that was taken in the afternoon over Weld County. In that sample, the ozone was already 70 ppb. So if this sample would not dilute and be put in a glass and was allowed to continue to make ozone, it would end up with 100 ppb of ozone before it would poop out. So it's not really representative of how much ozone you would have downwind of that. You would just make, if you were able to follow this until the end of the chemistry, it would make 100 ppb. Does that make sense? So it's a little bit taken, except that taking the oil and gas out again reduces that by about a third, which jives with what the transport model sees for the entire front range. And this is just kind of like a sanity check to make sure that we are doing the right thing with the 3D model. I hope that makes sense and answers your question.
It makes sense to me. But okay, so the next question is from Andy. Have you thought about a sensitivity study that would compare FRAPPÉ observations to what would have been observed in mid-March 2020 to June 2020, which I assume Andy is referring here to changes due to COVID? Yeah,
so unfortunately, of course, we weren't able to take the C-130 out and fly around during COVID. It would have been very, very interesting to do that. Now, Gabi and I have, and Gabi a little bit more than me, we've been looking at traffic counts and NOx data and looked at a little bit at this COVID impact. Of course, it's very hard to say what this impact might have been on the oil and gas industry. And unfortunately, we really don't have the data to do this. Were there slowdowns as a result of COVID in the production? And my guess is probably not, because when these oil wells are being put in and the production timeline is pretty tight, they really can't do anything. They have to do what they have to do. And the response to demand in oil and gas is usually kind of off phase a little bit. So yeah, while this would have been a fantastic experiment to go out and fly during the lockdown, unfortunately, all we have is the ground observations from the regulatory network, and there's very, very sparse data. It's often just ozone, PM2.5. There's 4 NOx monitors total in all of Colorado, and one of them is down in Las Animas for some reason. So it's very hard to really get anything out of this other than a relationship between traffic and NOx emissions. And we have looked at that quite a bit, and we have some results that are kind of half-baked at this point. Yeah, good question. Thank you for this.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Basically, just for your information, Andy, that traffic counts, for example, yes, we see that they have dropped significantly in April and March, and then specifically April. In May, they started going back to nearly 2019 values. And in June, I think they were only about 10% lower than 2019 values, at least at the stations in Denver where we have continuous traffic count monitoring. Yeah. So let's move on to the next question. Matthias Steiner. To what extent is the underestimation of emissions revealed by FRAPPÉ typical and seen in other areas around the country as well? And to what extent did your results raise awareness that emissions cataloging may require more attention?
Yeah, so thanks for that. Yes, so there have been numerous studies that looked particularly at methane. There probably have been the most studies that looked at methane emissions. And I have not seen yet a study where the emission inventory was higher than what was actually found. So very often this is the case. That the emissions are underestimated. And I think that as a result of it's very difficult to capture this. I don't want to push it all onto the industry. If you drive a truck around, for example, with produced water or with condensate, it's very difficult to estimate how much of that gets lost in the process. And when these things are pumped around and they're being brought to various stations. The oil and gas industry is aware of that, and they are pipelining more now, which should bring those emissions down. I think we raised quite a bit of awareness to the state of Colorado with what we found, because I think that the increased emission constraints that the state is putting on the industry are partially a result of our work. At least I'd like to hope so. They haven't done a lot with respect to other ways of bringing emissions down that we have suggested, but you know how the political process is always kind of too slow for us scientists to really appreciate. But yes, it's typical that the oil and gas emissions are underestimated.
Okay, let's move to a slightly different question from Chia-san. Great presentation. When you modulate the emissions, did you also investigate the biases from chemistry and meteorology in Wurfchem? And then, is the box model the ideal tool to investigate the chemistry employed in CTMs?
So these are like numerous questions here, and so maybe this didn't become quite clear. So yes, we did investigate the biases from chemistry and meteorology. So what we did is we only used flight segments where the model was doing particularly well. And we used those segments to compare what we expected to see with what was actually observed. So we had a little bit of a complicated algorithm where we selected the wind direction needed to be right, the wind speed needed to be within a certain window, and we needed to be downwind of an emission source that was representative for whatever mix we were looking at any given time. So yeah, we went through quite a process in order to eliminate as many biases as we could from that. And the box model is in so far an ideal tool to investigate the chemistry, as it tells you whether the chemistry that is simplified in the CTM is actually doing a good job, or as good a job as you can, to get the chemical products that are important in, for example, for ozone production or SOA production or whatever you're looking at, to get these processes as close as possible to reality. So in other words, you use the complicated box model to see how simple you can make the chemistry in the CTM and still get a reasonable result. So that's kind of the idea behind this. Hopefully that helps.
Excellent. Mary has a question here. How would the new inlet behave in the boundary layer where small cumulus clouds exist? With the ubiquity of clouds in the atmosphere that connect the land surface to the free troposphere, how would you address air quality affected by clouds? For example, it lists here as an example the SAS field study.
Yeah, so this is a good question. Clouds are particularly challenging because they can coat, as you know, can coat inlet walls with water and such. So we are hoping that this inlet would eliminate much of this. While if the clouds were particularly wet, you could probably still introduce water into the inlet of the system and therefore have your measurements in some way influenced by this. And the measurements in clouds are, as you know, notoriously difficult. And most people, when they're in really wet clouds, they take the measurements out or don't really know what they're doing. It's very hard to do. But because of the fact that most of the air is dumped in this inlet system, I think that it would do better for some species, at least, measuring in clouds than other things would do. And again, it's just a very, this is why we know so little about interstitial cloud air and things like that, because it's so damn hard to do. But it's a step forward. I think it's a step into the right direction for cloud chemistry. Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I hope it would.
And so maybe staying with the inlet, from Laura Pan, would the wall-less inlet reduce the flow rate for higher altitude flights?
It would function the same at high altitudes as it does everywhere. There would be possibly a small ram effect, so the pressure in front of the inlet would be a little bit higher than it would be in the free air. But we would probably reduce the pressure right in front of the instrument orifice by using some sort of differential pumping technique to something that is lower than the pressure outside of the aircraft anyway, because we would want to keep the intake flow to the instrument the same, independent of outside pressure. This is something we always do, and we would use that same technique there with just a bypass pump that would be servoed with the ambient pressure. So hopefully that makes sense to you as somebody that knows a little bit more about these intricacies of sampling from aircraft.
Excellent, very detailed. Tom Moore, great to see that you joined the webcast. Tom Moore is asking, what is the background term for ozone transported to already present in the Denver Front Range area on the days where you apportion specific source categories? And then a follow-up question, what about personal care products as a source?
Yeah, so the background term for ozone is the ozone in the Western United States in the summer. The background ozone is typically somewhere between 40 and 50 parts per billion, and it is increasing. It is increasing as a result of general emissions that are going into the Western air, ozone that already comes across the Pacific in an elevated way. So the northern latitude hemispheric background in the summer is just elevated to 45 to 50 parts per billion. And that can vary, if you had wildfires upwind, if you had any sort of, special circumstances, that background ozone can be quite a bit higher. It can also be higher when there is a stratospheric intrusion. Now, stratospheric intrusions are more likely in the springtime, but they do happen in the summer, and we actually had one happen during FRAPPÉ, where the ozone can be quite a bit higher. And of course, models, have typically forecast this to one way or another, but they all have different successes as far as how far down they extend and how much they actually influence surface ozone. But yes, it does happen. We did not, well, our modeling didn't include personal care products. I know this is a thing that has come up recently, and as a result of lower VOC emissions and such. But to be perfectly honest, I think the emissions of industrial VOCs and oil and gas VOCs in the NFRMA are so overwhelming that I cannot see personal care products as a major contributor to ozone. But that is probably something we should eventually look at. Again, if you look at an air sample composition, typically air sample composition over the metro area, the dominant hydrocarbons are industrial and oil and gas in nature that dominate the reactivity.
Okay. Oh, thanks also. So maybe just in the Denver area, we all don't shower enough. So let's quickly take two more questions since we already passed 4:30. Rajesh is asking, great presentation, Frank. Do you input fire emissions to GECO? If yes, how much of the discrepancy between GECO and observations can be attributed to uncertainties in fire emissions?
What we did so far is most of the modeling we did is where we just looked at the first pass and then modeled the consecutive passes downwind. So in that case, our emissions is the first observation. In the few cases where we used the fire lab emissions, we scaled them with CO. And for the Bear Trap fire, that happened to work quite well. If we do this for the Taylor Creek fire, and I already showed you the discrepancies we experienced, if we do this for Taylor Creek fire, it gets even worse. So yes, I think that uncertainties in fire emissions are large. The fire lab emissions are not really a good proxy for a real wildfire for numerous reasons. And I can get into some of those. you usually only have one type of vegetation that you're burning in the lab. In the real world, you can have fires burning uphill, downhill. That is a very different situation. They suck in things that are being boiled out of the trees that are getting heated before they're actually burning. They suck in smoldering fire from places that have already burned behind them, just because of the enormous amounts of oxygen that are being pulled into the flaming front. So this is all very difficult to do in the lab, and I believe that we'll have a long way to go before we can really make a good connection between real-world wildfires and laboratory. But you have to start somewhere. And the models are really handling wildfires in a very primitive way at this point, as you know. So anything that we can contribute will make things better.
Yeah, I agree in that. And so maybe, this leads also a little bit to the last question that we have from Kyle, that can you rationalize the different NOx observed in the two fires, like, for example, different fuels, fire temperatures, and you have touched on that already to some degree now. Right.
Thanks, Kyle. And so, yes, so there were a number of things that have been done, and you're aware of that, for the FireX experiment, where people have looked at FRP versus emissions and such. The Taylor Creek fire was certainly a hotter fire than the Bear Trap fire. One reason for that is you can see how high the fire plume went and how much it got pushed into the free troposphere for that particular fire. However, a factor of 10 in NOx requires some quite strong gradients in the temperatures. Again, the HONO emissions, they are what they are. We have to take the measurements for granted as of now. But the chemistry is sure awfully hot, and the NOx emission differences are awfully large. And rationalizing this with respect to the other observations that we have of the fire plumes is difficult. But again, this is in the beginning of analysis. We haven't really made it to the point yet where we are going back to correlating this with satellite data and such. But yes, that will have to be done at some point. Thanks for that question.
Excellent. Well, then I would like to thank Frank very, very much. Excellent presentation, really good Q&A session. Thanks everybody for watching, and also for the really good list of questions that we had. And I'm sure if there is any follow-up questions,
send me an email. I don't go anywhere these days, particularly.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks everybody.